Today, we'll get into beveling our knife and I'll take you through the intricacies of what's involved. All in all, it's turning out to be an okay knife. This is highly unrecommended workflow for creating a knife, but what's really interesting is not many people will show you all of these things that go wrong as a beginner knife maker, and that's what I'm here to do. I'm trying to show you a real count of what I'm experiencing as I'm experiencing it, and this is all part of it. So today we're talking about beveling, and we're going to do some beveling. Now, there are two parts of knife making that really are probably the hardest but most important thing: beveling and heat treating. You can create a knife out of a piece of steel if you just bevel it, put an angle on it, heat treat it well, you can cut things. And all the other bits and pieces have function, but they're not 100% necessary. Now, unfortunately, the two most necessary parts are the hardest. And there is so much to talk about in regards to beveling, way outside the scope of this video, but I'll give you a few things to think about and show you some practical tips on how to get what you want. And we'll go through the process from start to finish. But before we do that, I just want to talk about some of the bits and pieces that you'll need and some of the information that'll help you get to where you want to get to a little bit faster. First thing to talk about are the bevels and the angles. Now, there are a whole range of angles and bevel types, but from a beginner point of view, I like to break it down basically into two sections. There's essentially a kitchen knife grind, which is essentially a flat grind from the spine to the edge. And then there are your ECD or tactical style knives, which have a flat face, and then there's a grind line and an angle going down to the edge. Now, that's a really basic way to describe it, but here's a bit of a list of other bevels and the way they work. So there's a full flat, which goes from the spine all the way down to the edge. A saber grind, which is essentially a grind that is above the halfway line and comes down in a 45 degree to the edge. A chisel grind, which is a grind that is only on one side of the knife. Convex grind, which gives you a bowing grind from the spine to the edge. A hollow grind, which is like a convex grind. Now, these are done because apparently they give great food release. As you're cutting, the food slides off the knife a lot easier. And a Scandi grind, which starts further than halfway down the knife all the way to the edge. But for the knife today, we're going to be doing a saber grind. The other thing to know about beveling is there are two bevels. There's a primary bevel and a secondary bevel. The primary bevel is the main one you can see that makes up most of the knife. The secondary bevel is one that just runs along the sharp edge, and it basically brings the primary bevel into a much sharper point. With kitchen knives, often that is very, very fine because the flat bevel running all the way from the spine to the edge almost makes up the secondary bevel as well. But when the knife is sharpened, you often get a very fine secondary bevel along there as well. But on things like camping knives, the secondary bevel can be really quite defined and can make up a lot of the knife. And the reason you want to do that is because you want your knife to have a lot of meat, a lot of steel up in the top section, so it's nice and strong. You know, if you're getting into wood, things like that, you want the knife to be very strong and the bevel to be quite sharp in its angle. Okay, so there's a lot of choice when it comes to belts. Everything from the grit through to the stiffness of the backing to the maker of the belt. Obviously, there are many cheap versions to very expensive versions. But basically what we have, I ordered mine in grit types. So we've got 36, 50, 60, 100, 120, 120s, and then more the finishing belts up this end, which are only used some of the time. So the abrasive material you really need to think about. Some abrasives wear off faster, but they are cheaper. Others last longer, but they're more expensive. Some heat up a bit more than others, depending on which type of material that you're trying to grind. So basically there are ceramic materials, aluminium oxide, zirconia. They're sort of the three mains. And there's also the stiffness of the material. There's stiff backed, which is great for really hard hogging off of material as quickly as you can, through to quite soft J-flex material, which is really nice for getting curved surfaces, wrapping it around the side of your platen so that you can get into smooth plunge lines, things like that. So there's a lot to think about. I'm not going to go into it all here because it's a very long conversation. But basically what I use is ceramic belts with stiff back for the primary bevel, all the way up to basically getting up to my grind line. And then I start to use J-flex belts if I'm doing anything with a plunge line that's not hard. And also a lot of these belts, the J-flex and the higher grits, are really great for when you're doing some handle work. There's a 240 grit here, scalloped edge, which gives you a really great surface to be able to manipulate your handles and the soft materials there really well. I think that's enough about belts and is worth getting onto some of the grinding. So before we get onto any grinding, I'll just quickly show you my setup. So this is a homemade grinder. I didn't have the funds to buy a grinder. They start, sort of anywhere around the $1,200 mark and go up from there. And one day I'll do that. But this was a grinder that I made. I took the motor out of an old treadmill, found the treadmill on Gumtree for $50 and took it apart. Bought a speed controller and some very basic electrics at JCar in Australia, kind of like Radio Shack in a way. And then I just went to the local steel place and bought a bunch of this box section steel. I don't have any fancy attachments like small wheels. I can't rotate this thing on a 90 degree. I just have a work surface. I have my platen, some wheels, this articulating arm, which obviously helps me get the belts on. Variable speed controlling just saves the day in a lot of circumstances. Now, next to your grinder, this is a horrible looking bucket. It's just basically water, cold water, to keep your blades cool while you're grinding. I've also set up this little catchment area here, which is plugged into a shop vac, just to mitigate some of the dust and shavings and everything that goes with grinding. And I've only recently done that, and I've found that it's really cut my mess in half, probably even more than half, to be honest. Sometimes the shop would just get full of dust, and it was pretty horrible. So that is recommended if you can do it. Anyway, let's get on to looking at some grinding. Okay, so just to begin, we've got a few things to do. What we want to do is we want to mark the center line so that we know where our bevel is going to come to on both sides. Once you've started beveling this, it's impossible to know how far, well, it's not impossible, it's very difficult to know how far you need to go on both sides unless you've got your center mark. So what I like to do is use some of this engineer's layout die. You can just use a Sharpie, run the Sharpie down there and then scribe a line into that, but this stuff is just a bit more accurate. So basically get some of that on there. It's nice luminous blue. Let that dry for a second. In the meantime, the other thing that we do is we mark where we want our grind line to start so that we know as we're pulling the bevel up where we want to stop. And I like to use some calipers for this. So you basically get an idea of where you want to be, and in a moment, once the engineer's die is done, we will just scribe that line in there. So now that the engineer's die is dried, basically going to get my calipers, run them along and you can see a nice scribe line. There we are. Do both sides. Now, to mark the center line, there are all sorts of things you can use. You can get proper center scribes. I don't have anything like that. What I like to do Make sure you've got a nice flat surface. I've just got an old tile from the house. I lay my knife down. I get a bit which is roughly the right size. Just check which bits you want. Ideally it's either a smidge smaller or a smidge bigger. That's because ideally you want 2 center lines just off center, running either side, so you can see where you're bringing your first bevel to, and I'll explain that in a minute. So I get the bit, I lay this down, lay the bit down, and then run the bit along the edge, and then flip it over, do the other side. And then with luck, we have 2 very fine lines. You might be able to see, there we go. Those 2 fine lines, we want to grind up to those lines. And the reason I have 2 lines rather than a single center line is I like to bevel to not quite a perfect sharp point, edge before I heat treat. I find especially with kitchen knives, if you're doing a flat grind all the way from the spine to the edge, and you come all the way to a tip, when you heat treat and then you quench your knife, you're a lot more likely to get warps in the knife. If you haven't quite come to a perfect tip, there's just still a bit of meat in the middle there, you're much less likely to warp the blade during heat treat. So that's why I create 2 very close lines to grind into now. Something to note here as a beginner, when you first start beveling, especially on these rough 36 grit, there's a lot of steel flying around into your hands, and it's just something to ignore. But when you first start, it can be kind of strange and off-putting. Now the key to getting successful bevel is holding the same angle through this grind, and you do need to rotate the knife as you get towards the tip, but holding the same angle is very, very important. Now things are going pretty well. You can see that the bevel at the tip is a little wider than it is down the belly, but we'll start working on the other side and work that bit out a bit later. So this is where things really start to go wrong. This is obviously the side that I'm not very comfortable with, and you can see how the grind line is just really quite wrong. It's fatter at the tip than it is down near the choil. So I'm just going to try and work on that a bit. So I want to show you where I grind to. You can see that there is an edge, a flat edge along there. See how the light picks up that edge. That's where I like to grind to. Now it's very difficult to get the tip exactly the same. You can see that this tip is really very sharp. Unfortunately, I've just gone a little bit too far there. It hasn't gone over the center line, but in regards to the rest of the knife, you can see that the light just doesn't quite pick up the edge. That's because it's come right to an apex, which isn't what you want, but it's not the end of the world. Okay, a bit of a learning moment. This is a common mistake as a beginner. You get this smile in your bevels. Just got to try and flatten that out now. Okay, so I wanted to stop at this point and show you what's going on. Basically, everything that could go wrong is going wrong. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because we can learn from it. It's a bad thing because that's not what I want to do. So, I've made mainly kitchen knives to this point. And so there's not really a specific grind line along the face to follow to. So you're grinding from the spine down to the edge, and in one way it's much harder to do that to get a flat grind. You often get a lot of facets in there. These are some of the knives that I've made, so just a little bit of proof that I can actually grind a knife. But what's happening here is I need obviously a lot more practice on doing knives that actually have a grind line and a plunge line. So here we go. What's happening is there's a lot of geometry on a knife. So where we have the choil and we have the plunge line on both sides needs to be the same. There is the grind line, which on both sides needs to be the same. Where the grind line finishes at the spine needs to be the same. The centering of the grinds need to be the same. So everything has got to be symmetrical, and that's one of the very, very hard parts about grinding the bevels. Also, you can see very clearly the tip. So I've overheated the tip too much. When the steel is not hardened, that's not too much of a problem because we're going to be hardening it. But if you do that after you've hardened, basically what that means is you've overheated it beyond critical temperature, and that's probably going to be soft now. So you'd need to reheat treat. There's also, when I look down the knife one direction, it looks very symmetrical. It's really nice. If I look from the other direction, it's not. What that's telling me is one side is convexed ground and the other side is a nice flat grind. One thing that is going right is I don't have facets in my bevel. So it might be hard to see, but there's no faceting going on. It's quite a nice flat grind. You can see, just for illustrative purposes, just here there is one facet, but everything else is pretty good. So there's a bonus. What I'm going to have to do at this point, I think, is re-ink, re-mark my grind line, drop down to a finer belt because I am at my thickness. Now, another thing that happens when you're a beginner is that the thickness of the blade here is, so where I've ground to, it's not sharp, there's a dull surface there. Up at the tip, this is something I endlessly do, not sure if you can see it, there is no meat there. So it's almost sharp, and that's a very common mistake as well. So I've got a lot of fixing to do. I probably won't bother checking in until I really need to, but essentially it's a good start, but it's messy as hell. Okay, so another check-in. A lot's happened since the last one. So it looks neater and nicer, but what happened was I overshot my grind line. I'm used to, as making kitchen knives, getting the knife nice and flat on the platen and then working and putting pressure in a certain way, which meant that I shot all the way up to the edge, the spine. So then I thought, well, gonna have to match that on the other side. So basically started doing that, which is fine. Okay, so this is an interesting part of knife making. This by no means is a lost cause knife. No way. Still gonna make a really cool knife out of it. It's just not what I designed and not what I wanted. Something else that happened, because I was freaking out about my grind lines overshooting, I started to get too close to the edge. And so I really ground into this front edge about that much. And it went all a little bit bacony, to be honest. So I had to get onto the grinder and give it a little bit of a new shape. I tried that with the 36 grit because that's what I was on. Realized as I was doing that the point was getting pushed down by all the large grit, so it kept on bending. Tried it the other way, bent the tip the other way. So I switched over to a 120 J-Flex belt, very soft, nice, easy, and just very gently reshaped my knife. And now the shape's great. The shape is lovely. So it's not the knife I designed, but it's still going to be a fantastic knife. Now the only things that are really going wrong now, the grinds, once again, nice and flat. I don't have any faceting in there. The one thing that's wrong is on this side, the angle of the bevel is slightly steeper than this side, so it looks like the knife is going off in this direction. The actual edge is perfectly straight, so that's great. It's just that I'm not sure if you can see that, but it's just not a straight and even bevel on either side. Quick side note, as we all know, a bad tradesman blames his tools. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to say there's an influencing factor on the quality of my belt grinder. So what I'm finding is that because I'm no engineer and I built this thing before I knew anything really about knife making, my belt, you might have seen, tends to walk a little bit. It sort of oscillates backwards and forwards. Also, I have a real problem getting the belt to sit on this side. It will sit over here for a little bit, maybe for 20 seconds, and then it shoots back over to this side. So I'm really struggling with things like that. So that's where my plunge lines aren't perfect. This plunge line, you may be able to see, it's not really showing up very well, but is not even from one side to the other. That's mainly because on one side, this belt flexes around there and I have trouble keeping it exactly where I want it. And on this side, it just doesn't stay for very long. So I'm often trying to grind the plunge lines on a belt that sits like this. And that's far from ideal. So to a degree, I'm battling with the hardware. But you know, I got to work on this. So as this kind of turned into more of an experiment than a pre-designed knife, I thought I might go ahead and try something else, giving it a little bit of a shape down the spine here. I put this little divot in. One, because I am experimenting. Two, because I did some fun grinding and it didn't look very good. So all in all, it's turning out to be an okay knife. This is highly unrecommended workflow for creating a knife, but what's really interesting is that not many people will show you all of these things that go wrong as a beginner knife maker, and that's what I'm here to do. I'm trying to show you a real count of what I'm experiencing as I'm experiencing it, and this is all part of it. was an interesting exercise. Many things went wrong with this knife. I got it to a point where I'm sort of happy with it, but there are so many issues, but they won't affect the use of the knife for my son, to be honest. So I'm going to go ahead with it as it is. And there's a bunch of things I can probably work out in hand sanding anyway. But what was interesting was seeing the cascade of issues that went on. But you know, it's all a learning exercise. So I'm looking forward to getting on to the next one, seeing how my learnings from this affect that. And yeah, let's move on, and we will see you in heat treating for the next one.